before I get started, I was invited to share a little bit about who my mentors were. And I'm a very fortunate person in that I've had really just a succession of mentors all through my life. I'm 66 now, so a lot of my mentors have been about 20 years older than me. And I'm at a stage in life now where I've outlived most of my mentors. I'm sure new ones keep coming along, and in some ways, I think we all hope that we can get to a place where every person we're with in some ways can be a kind of mentor to us, that there's always something that we can learn from whose ever presence we enjoy. But when I was a teenager, there was a fellow who was 8 or 10 years older than me, named Dave, who I didn't like. He attended my church. I didn't know him well. I know it's a little hard to believe with my current hairstyle, but I was working hard on being a hippie. I had long hair and a beard. And this guy was sort of a, clean cut, athletic guy. And we just were in very, very different worlds. But he was one of these people who wouldn't take no for an answer and invited me to a little fellowship group. I was on Saturday nights, I was playing in a little rock and roll band, and I didn't get home till 2 or 3 in the morning very often on Saturday night. But he wanted to pick me up at 8 a.m. on Sunday morning to bring me to this little fellowship group of other men. And he drove about 45 minutes out of his way to pick me up and bring me to this meeting. And so I just kind of went because I couldn't figure out a way to say no. I couldn't figure out a way to say, no, don't come pick me up. And so I started going. And it was in that small group of men. I was the youngest by, like I say, about 8 or 10 years. But where I think for the first time I encountered men sharing honestly and openly, really in the spirit that Bill just talked about, speaking from the heart, listening from the heart, being spontaneous, and not speaking any one person more than they really needed to make themselves understood. And I felt I was being exposed to a kind of sincere Christian faith that was very different than what I think I was used to in my church. So because of my church life, I felt I was kind of on my way out of Christian faith, but in that small group, I really was introduced to something that was real and that kind of intersected with me and touched me very deeply and put me on a path of curiosity. Sometime after that, I had a very powerful kind of spiritual experience where I felt the presence of God, the reality of the love of God, and by far the center of that first real personal spiritual experience in my life was just that whatever God is love, and so that really set me on a path that I've been on ever since. And through the years, it just seemed, as the old saying goes, that when I needed a new one appeared. And so I've been blessed with just a succession of good mentors down through the years. And I'll be happy to answer any additional questions about that. But I thought I would tell you a little bit about Dave. The only other thing I'll mention about Dave is that he really stayed a friend through the years. And the last time I saw him, he was in the beginning processes of descending into dementia. And it was a very hurtful, I didn't know at the time that he had dementia. It was quite a hurtful interchange. He said some things that just seemed to be kind of cruel and completely out of character. And about 2 years later, he died, and his wife explained to me that was the beginning of his descent into dementia, a kind of a parting wound, but also I think when I understood that it was a part of his illness that was affecting his judgment and the way he interacted, I think it helped me just understand this is part of the frailty of life. And so that's a bit about my first mentor. I was asked to talk a little bit about this new book, Do I Stay Christian, that came out in May. And by way of kind of the reasoning for writing the book, many of you would know that if we were to go in the United States, the standard statistic is that about 40% of people attend church with some amount of frequency, maybe once a month or a couple times a year at least. Somewhere between 70 and 80% of people identify as having a religious affiliation or identity, but every generation that we go down, the percentage increases. The percentage decreases of people who maintain a religious affiliation. So much so that if you look around the whole world, the largest religious group in the world is Christian. About 31 to 33% of the world's population identifies in some way as Christian. The next largest group is Muslim. Somewhere around 24% of the world's inhabitants identify as Muslim. The next percentage used to be Hindu, about 17 or 18%. But what's happened in the last 10 years or so is that the third largest religious group now is the nones, people who identify with no religious identity. So it goes Christian, Muslim, non, and then Hindu, and then all of the other, and Hindus somewhere around 16, 17%. And then all other religious identities make up the rest, something like 10%. So something is happening in the world where a lot of our traditional religious communities are losing their hold on younger generations. The more urban they are, the more educated they are, the more well-traveled they are. It seems that something begins to disintegrate. And so this issue of the need for genuine spirituality, and yet the sense that traditional religious formulations often aren't working the way they used to. This has been a big part of my life and my life's work. As Bill mentioned, I was a college English teacher, and then I became a pastor. I was a pastor of the same congregation for 24 years. And during that time, I began to write about what I was observing in the religious world. And I began to write about my own Christian experience and theology. And so since for the last 16 years, I've been really working as a writer and speaker. And I speak a lot to clergy, probably one of the people in the country who, at least before COVID, spoke to the most clergy in an average year. And I'm honored to get to speak across Protestant denominations, Roman Catholics, sometimes Eastern Orthodox, and then I've had the opportunity to do a lot of interfaith work as well. But I wanted to write this book about the struggle that many of us are having with Christian identity. The word now seems to be able to mean opposite things. For some people, to identify as Christian means I'm the kind of person who cares about the poor, and I'm a kind of person who cares about immigrants and refugees, and I'm the kind of person who cares about the outsider and the outcast and the vulnerable. But for other people, to be a Christian means I think that the poor are responsible for their poverty, and so in a sense, I shame the poor. Or I think that refugees and aliens should go back to where they came from. Or if I see people in need, I think that's not my problem. They've gotten themselves into this mess, and they'll have to get themselves out. People identifying by the name Christian, it can mean opposite things. For some of us, to say I'm a Christian means, of course, it means I love my LGBTQ neighbors. because all people are God's beloved children. And for other people, it means in God's name, I try to put up a wall and say those people are unacceptable, and I need to make sure that they're kept at a distance. So on. The word Christian seems to mean opposite things. For me, my Christian faith has made me care about the earth, and especially in this time of extinction of species, climate change, loss of topsoils, loss of fisheries. For any of us who love the outdoors, this sense that wherever we go, there's less wild, and that the earth is struggling under human domination. And my sense is that this is God's beloved earth. And because of my Christian faith, I care about the earth. But there are many other people. And in fact, I have to be honest, I was taught in this other way to say, look, we're all going to heaven soon. God is going to destroy the earth. We might as well return it empty, meaning it doesn't really have a future. What's important is human souls. So I hope you get a feel for what I'm saying when I say that the word Christian can mean such opposite things to different people that a whole lot of people are wondering, what does that identity even mean anymore? And many of us feel in order to use the term, we have to add all kinds of qualifiers to say which kind of Christian I am to distinguish myself from other people. And so what I wanted to do is write about this struggle with Christian identity. And I structured the book with three main parts. Part one, simply called No. And I wanted to give the 10 best reasons that I'm aware of for a person to not stay Christian. In my travels, in my inbox, in my speaking engagements, I have people confiding to me constantly about their struggles. And you'd be surprised the number of clergy who not only are thinking about leaving ministry, but also have thought very, very deeply about leaving Christian identity as a whole. So I wanted to try to take those concerns that people have and summarize them and express them as honestly as I possibly could. And my goal in doing this wasn't to hold up the reasons people are saying to leave Christian faith and then shoot them down as if to say, you're obligated now to stay Christian because I took down your good reasons for leaving. That wasn't my motivation at all. I think these reasons are serious, and people's questions and frustrations and difficulties they have to be taken seriously. Let me also say that sometimes the reasons people want to leave Christian faith are, you might say, intellectual. They have problems with traditional Christian teachings. Sometimes they're historic. They have to do with ways that the Christian faith has behaved through history. Sometimes, though, they're deeply personal. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of us on this call maybe have experienced abuse at the hands of religious leaders. And so when you think about your Christian identity, you can't separate it from the harm that was done to you. Could have been by a religious parent. It could have been by a priest or pastor, or just a kind of religious community in general. And so all of those issues, I think, come to play in the reasons that people have for saying no. And I want to leave plenty of time for you all to ask questions. So I'm not going to try to summarize everything in the book, but I'll just mention the 10 different reasons that are in part one. First, because Christianity has been vicious to its mother. When I say its mother, I'm referring to Judaism. Jesus was Jewish. All of the first Christians were Jewish. And it's almost impossible to explain how this could happen, but within a couple of generations of Jesus, major sectors of what came to be known as the Christian faith, and we should say in early Christianity, there were very diverse Christian communities, but many of those early Christians became increasingly anti-Semitic. to the point that when you get to the second and third centuries, it seems the norm in Western Christianity was to carry a kind of prejudice and bias against Jewish people, which only grew through the Middle Ages and really reached its zenith in the anti-Semitism of the Nazis in World War II. But in recent years, there's been a shocking and ugly resurgence of Christian anti-Semitism, both here in the United States, but also in many places around the world. Many white supremacists and terrorists who've committed atrocities. When you read the screeds that they often write, very often they start picking up and repeating old anti-Semitic tropes that have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this first reason is a really significant one. A lot of Christians don't know about it. If you're interested in reading a really good introduction just to the issue of Christian anti-Semitism, Thomas Cahill wrote a book called Constantine's Sword. And in it, he tries to give an overview of Christian anti-Semitism. I won't go into that much detail on all the others, or we'll be here for too long. But second is because of Christianity's suppression of dissent. And this is the history of the way that Christians have treated their fellow Christians who were nonconformists in some way, especially doctrinal nonconformists, but sometimes they were nonconformists in terms of practice as well. Third is because of Christianity's high global death toll and life toll. And what I do in this chapter is I combine two things that are often kept separate, but I think they're really two parts of one story. It's the story of the Crusades and the story of colonialism, which are the story of the way that when Christians gain power, have gained power, they use their power against the religious other. Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, atheists, and so on. Fourth is because of Christianity's loyal company men, and this is the way I try to describe institutionalism. The way that Christian insiders to the organization find themselves out of loyalty to the church or their denomination or their congregation or their own ministry sometimes. They behave in ways that harm others, and then they cover up that harmful behavior. And we've seen, of course, a lot of this in headlines in recent years. The fifth chapter is about the power of money in Christian organizations. Ironically, Jesus, some of his strongest words were about money. He said, you either will love God and hate money, or love money and hate God. You can't have much stronger language than that. And yet the power of money in Christian settings is far more far-reaching, I think, than many of us realize. Sixth is because of the white Christian old boys network. And here I combine patriarchy and white supremacy and this power of dominant white men to put their own interests above the interests of women and LGBTQ people and people who are not white. It's just a whole combination that actually is often associated with the term toxic masculinity. And I would imagine a group like Illuman is trying to pay attention to those realities when you're thinking about what does it mean to be truly loving men. The seventh chapter was because Christianity is stuck. And I talked about toxic theology and the ways that in some ways Christianity paints itself into a corner and doesn't give itself room to grow and learn over time. Then chapter 8, I talked about a lack of transformation, a personal transformation. Chapter 9, a kind of constricted intellectualism. In chapter 10, the problem of demographics, that when older Christians drive away younger Christians generation after generation, the average age rises, and this puts a whole set of dynamics into play. So those are the 10 chapters of the first of the first part of the book. And I think a lot of people told me when they finished those first 10, they thought, well, why even read the rest of the book? It seemed like a pretty damning overview. But actually, when I was writing and I got to the end of those 10 chapters, I felt it was even more important than to turn to part 2. And part 2 basically says, is there a way to stay Christian with your eyes wide open to those first 10 realities? And in other words, to say, I would like to stay Christian, but I don't want to minimize these problems and pretend they aren't as big and real as they are. I want to face them with my eyes wide open. And is there a way to stay Christian? And that's what the 10 chapters of part 2 deal with. And I'll just run through those very briefly. Chapter 11, because leaving hurts allies and helps their opponents. There are so many good and wonderful people doing good and wonderful things in the Christian community. And when people leave, when good people leave, it makes it much harder for those people who are trying to do good. And in a certain sense, it makes it much easier for the people who I think are abusing Christian faith. Chapter 12, because leaving defiantly and staying compliantly are not my only options. And in that chapter, I tell the story of a couple of spunky and brilliant and insightful nuns who helped me realize that there is a way to stay Christian with a kind of courageous, gracious defiance for the ways that the Christian faith is being abused. Chapter 13 is about where else would I go? And I reflect on the story where a lot of people are leaving Jesus, and he says to the disciples, are you guys leaving too? And they say, well, where else would we go? And this realization that if you leave Christianity, you still find out the same kinds of problems turn up in other religious groups, or they turn up in political groups or in social groups, that they tend to be human problems. The next chapter, because it would be a shame to leave a religion in its infancy. And what I suggest in that chapter is that the Christian faith, when it's put among its peers of other world religions, is actually relatively young, and is in many ways showing the kind of immaturities we might expect. And maybe that's why many of us now are struggling, because we think it's time for our faith community to mature. Chapter 15 is one of the most important chapters. It just says, because of our legendary founder. And for all of the times many of us have experienced disillusionment with Christian theology or Christian institutions or Christian history or Christian subcultures, I think, in contrast, the life and teaching and example of Jesus just becomes even more compelling. Chapter 16 was one of the chapters that I felt in some ways was most important to write. It's because innocence is an addiction and solidarity is the cure. The idea here is that if I say the Christian religion seems polluted, and I don't want to seem polluted, so I'm going to cut myself off from the Christian religion because I think it's polluting me. I want to prove my own innocence. As soon as you start realizing that the process of cutting off others to manifest and prove your own innocence in itself is not a very innocent act. And I hope that chapter will be helpful for many of you as we start thinking about what I call in that chapter, borrowing from a friend of mine, the cult of innocence. Chapter 17 talks about humanity and that these problems in Christianity are problems in humanity. And in some ways, I think part of the opposite of innocence, instead of trying to cut off anything in humanity that seems to besmirch my reputation, if I'm able to say, these are human problems, they're problems in other people, they're also problems in me. And I'm more likely to actually confront and experience transformation in relation to these problems if I accept them as part of the human condition and understand it's part of my human work just as Bill said as we began, to do that inner work and face those deep struggles in search of transformation. Chapter 18 is because Christianity is changing for the worse and for the better. And maybe I can just say one thing about that. I think if you identify as a Christian and you're, like me, disturbed about a lot of things that are being said and done in the name of Christianity, I wouldn't expect things to get better in the short run. I think we're going to see major sectors of Christianity that are behaving in unhealthy ways. I think they'll get unhealthier in the coming years. But I also think simultaneously that as certain aspects of the Christian faith become more decadent and lose their way, I think we'll see other forms of Christian faith experience renewal and transformation in positive ways. And I think we're going to have to hold that tension of things simultaneously getting worse in some quarters and better in other quarters. Chapter 19 is called To Free God. And I talk about the understanding of God that Christians commonly share, and how that understanding is going through deep, deep change. I think necessary change, because we're seeing the world differently, and human beings as a species, in a sense, we're seeing differently, and that's going to challenge us to see God in some fresh ways. And then chapter 20 is a chapter about human survival. It's called Because of Fermi's Paradox and the Great Filter, but it's a chapter about human survival and the role that I think our religious communities must play in our struggle for survival at this difficult juncture where we are. So that's part 2. And then I'll just say a few things about part 3, and then we'll open it up for questions. And I hope all of you will feel free to bring up any question that's on your mind. So part 1, no. Part 2, yes. And then what I, in a sense, do is I say, look, there are ways, I think, that all of us are going to have to say a simultaneous no and yes to different forms and elements of Christianity. And whether we say, no, I don't want to identify as Christian anymore, or we say, yes, I'm still in, we've got to wake up tomorrow and answer the question, how are we going to live? What kind of people do we want to be? And that question of how, it seems to me at the end of the day, is the question that really is most important. And I think in a certain sense, it's the most Christian question of all. Not what label do I want to wear, but what kind of human being do I want to be? And in the last 8 chapters, I talk about 8 processes that I think we'll want to engage in, whether we identify as Christian or not, that will help us, I think, become a better kind of human being than we've been before. And of course, this is I think what must attract men like you and your friends and loved ones who are part of this conversation too, to a group like Illuman. I think one of the things that attracts people to a group like this is to say, if I can look at what happened to me over the last 10 years, or the last 20 years, and I might not be happy with what I saw happening to myself. And I thought, I better become more intentional about the kind of person I'm going to become, the kind of person I want to be. And so those last 8 chapters are where I try to deal with that very, very important question. And I'll just run through them very quickly. The chapter 21 is called Include and Transcend. And I talk about learning to see our own development in terms of a succession of stages. And that very often we reach a place where we're ready to break through into a new stage. And that won't be the last stage. There'll be new stages beyond that as well. Then next, start with the heart. And in that chapter, I talk about the primacy of desire that learning to become intentional about the desires that we want to promote, to become conscious of the desires that are driving our lives, and to become intentional about the desires that we want to nurture. It seems to me, however we identify, that's going to be a really critical question. And I talk about how at the core of Jesus' great commandment, to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And in today's world, if you love God, your neighbor, and yourself, you need to love the earth that you and your neighbor depend on, and that is God's work of art. The love for God, neighbor, self, and the earth, that becomes a kind of desire for something that's just bigger than your own ego, bigger than your own self-interest, bigger than your own comfort or wealth or success, and so on. That's the issue of desire. The next chapter, I talk about rewilding and the need for us to resituate ourselves in the natural world. One of the things that's happened to us in an increasingly technological civilization is that we've lost touch with the natural rhythms and logic that's built right into creation. And so that is a super important chapter in my mind, learning to rewild. Chapter 24, I talk about finding the flow, looking for the life-giving movements that are happening in our culture, and learning to orient our lives with larger life-giving movements. Chapter 25 is about reconsecrating everything, learning to see all of life as sacred and meaningful and significant. Chapter 26, renounce and announce. This is a chapter where I talk about our need to let people know that we have changed, and to let people know that we are changing, and to let people know when we feel something unjust is being said or done, and finding ways constructively to differ graciously, courageously, and constructively, to set ourselves to set ourselves apart, and not to make ourselves better than anyone else, but to say, I don't think this is right. I can't be silent about this. I need to speak up. Chapter 27 is about staying loyal to reality and actually caring about the truth. We live, as you all know, in a world of conspiracy theories and self-congratulatory narratives, and to really care, to really desire that, and to know the truth. It brings us back to that issue of desire, but we're at a really interesting time in history with this, because one of the things that we've become enlightened about is that we're not that enlightened, meaning that there are so many biases that affect the clarity of our own thought, and to become aware of the glitches in our own rationality, in a certain sense, is humbling, but also then prepares us to seek to stay loyal to reality. And then finally, the last chapter is about staying human and taking seriously what it means to be a growing, honest, authentic human being. I know that Father Richard Rohr has played a big role in the history of Illuman, and of course Richard is a close friend and colleague. And one of the things that Richard says again and again in a dozen different ways is that he believes that Jesus didn't come to make us religious. We might even say he didn't even come to make us Christian, but he came to help us be fully and truly human. And so that's a summary of this book. And I hope that's enough to get us going, to have some questions. And so let me stop there, and we'll open it up. And I'd love to hear from as many of you as possible.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Yes, thank you. So maybe the way we'll work it is